Symposium today. I'm Dr. Prabha Kodishwaran. I'm Professor of Law at King's College London, and I'm the PI for an EU-supported project called the Laws of Social Reproduction. So this symposium is co-hosted by the Laws of Social Reproduction, as well as Delhi-based iWage and FESDIC, which is the Feminist Economist Saturday discussion group. So it has been almost a year since the pandemic, and I think all of us are feeling a little bit like this woman in the picture. No matter what combination of paid or unpaid work we are in fact doing. And as many feminist reports and journals are documenting, I think certainly in the West, women are falling off the paid work ladder in very high proportions. And some are arguing that we are back to 1980s levels of female workforce participation rates. Now, in a country like India, where the female labor force participation rates were already declining, it has meant again that there are women in wage employment who are also losing jobs, but also that women are performing much higher levels of unpaid work, sometimes even meeting with physical violence when it's not up to a certain standard. So I think feminists post-pandemic have not missed an opportunity to remind governments and opinion makers and all of us, society at large, of what they've been saying for a very long time, which is that whether you call it social reproduction or reproductive labor or care work or care or life's work, the reality is that women perform a very high level of unpaid work, which is what keeps the wheels of the economy and of society churning and has been for several centuries. So, for example, the 2018 ILO report observed that 16.4 billion hours of unpaid work were performed every day. So in effect, if you took 2 billion people who did 8 hours of unpaid work per day, that is the level of unpaid work that is being performed routinely day in and day out. And of course, they put a minimum wage figure on it and estimated that it was worth 11 trillion US dollars, about 9% of global GDP. Now, both anticipating a crisis while also responding to the pandemic, I think feminists have seized the opportunity to, produce a number of feminist manifestos for change. So we see pre-pandemic already, we had the manifesto Feminism for the 99%, and post-pandemic, very quickly, the CARE manifesto was published by the CARE Collective. We also have the Green New Deal for Europe here, which recommends a care income. We also have a full-page ad taken out in the New York Times by US-based tech entrepreneur Reshma Sajani called The Marshall Plan for Moms. So clearly feminists have been very, very busy. And I think not to be left behind, our very own Kamal Hassan of the Makkan Nidhi Mayam has proposed as an election promise a salary for housewives. So this moment of rupture has given us hope and an opportunity to revisit the wages for housework movement, which in my view offers the most incisive analysis of the subsidies that unpaid work offers to both capitalism as well as patriarchy. And what is remarkable about the movement was that it uses the figure of the housewife as emblematic not only for the unpaid work that women do, but also for the subsistence work that both men and women do in developing countries. So there's a very strong understanding of the international division of labor. So this symposium is inspired by the pioneering work of these feminists. And over the next 3 days, we want to think of how wages for housework as a perspective and as a strategy can be relevant for our current moment, which offers opportunities for reconstruction. So the symposium will consist of 4 sessions today and tomorrow. The first session will involve a retelling of the histories of wages for housework. The second session will reflect on feminist economists' initiatives to reconceptualize, but to also measure in quite innovative ways the unpaid work that women do. And then session 4 will focus on the care infrastructure of the Indian state in particular, and whether Indian law recognizes the unpaid work of women, and if so, how it does that. So we will conclude the symposium finally with a debate on March 6th, where we will address one particular aspect of the Wages for Housework movement, which is the proposal that we pay salaries, or you could call it a subsidy or an allowance or a transfer for housework. So that will be the debate topic on March 6th. So I just want to remind you that the link you are on right now will be the link for the 4 sessions today and tomorrow. But there is a separate link for the March 6th debate. And I will share the link for registration shortly, and please register for that. And if you like to tweet, we're using the hashtag Wages for Housework. You can also use International Women's Day 2021. And with that, I want to hand over to Professor Shamita Sen, who's the Hamsworth Professor of Imperial and Naval History at the University of Cambridge. She's also fellow and senior lecturer at Trinity College, and her specialization, as we all know, is in gender and labor in South Asia. And Professor Sen has very kindly agreed to chair and moderate our session, so I'm very grateful to her. So I will now pass on to Professor Sen. Thank you.
Thank you, Prabha, and a very good morning to all of you, and good afternoon to those who are joining us from India and various other parts of the world, which is the new pandemic format of these meetings. You lose a lot, but you gain some as well. So I would like to start by thanking Prabha and the Law of Reproduction Project for organizing this symposium. It's a very, as Prabha has already outlined, I think it's a very important moment in which to make this intervention. And we have with us many of the pioneers of debates on and around these questions. So this I welcome all the panelists to this session. We will start with Nina Lopez, who joined the Wages for Housework campaign in 1976, so one of the early pioneers. She is joint coordinator of the Global Women's Strike and founder of Legal Action for Women, which coordinates support, not separation, fighting to stop the unjust removal of children from their mothers. She edited Some Mother's Daughter, The Hidden Movement of Prostitute Women Against Violence, Creating a Caring Economy. And she is author of The Perspective of Caring. She's originally from Argentina, but lives in London. And her bio says she is a mother, which is very important because I am not. Nina.
Thank you very much. Is there a reason why I can't see you?
Not that I know. I can see myself.
I wonder.
Can you see the panel at the bottom?
All I can see is little round things with people. Let me see. I mean, I can see it says Samita there, but I can't actually. There you are. Okay. It's so much better to be speaking to somebody than to a blank screen. Well, thank you very much. We are very delighted to be involved in this symposium on wages for housework, which is a very favorite topic for discussion at any time. So Prabha, very, very thanks for that, and also for your introduction. Now, I thought I would give a quick rundown of the International Wages for Housework campaign, because there's a lot of misinformation out there. So I think it's good to start on a sound basis. Now, first of all, as you said, I am originally from Argentina. And so the fact that the Wages for Housework campaign was international, and that it wasn't just the North, but it encompassed the global South, was very important to me when I met them in 1976. It had started in 1972. That's when Selma James put forward wages for housework at the Manchester Women's Liberation Conference in March. There were 6 demands, and wages for housework was one of them. Thelma was also the co-author of The Power of Women and the Subversion of the Community, which is a classic, which put the whole issue of housework, of domestic work, on the agenda. She was also the author in 1952 of A Woman's Place. So by the time wages for housework was put forward, there was already a whole history of how to look at what women were doing and what we were doing from our own point of view. And in 1973, she put out another classic, which was Sex, Race, and Class. So wages for housework, as you said, Prabha, was not just a demand, but it was a perspective for organizing. It redefined the working class internationally to include all unwaged workers, workers in the home, on the land, and in the community, starting with housewives. Now, somebody's not on mute, so I'm hearing some papers. Sorry. Starting with housewives. Until then, the left had only been interested in the so-called point of production. In fact, they continued largely to only be interested in the so-called point of production. But what Wages for Housework said was housewives are also working for capital because we produce and reproduce the whole human race and the whole working class, so that without us, nothing. Our perspective was not welcomed by the left. They wanted all women to go out to work and get trade union consciousness. Now, Wages for Housework was different. It didn't necessarily think that trade union consciousness was that great. So it was not welcome also by many feminists who were anxious to join the managerial class, to pursue careers, become part of management, and to turn their backs on housewives and mothers. So, but from the beginning, as you said, we were international and we were anti-racist. We started with power relations between men and women, between the waged and the unwaged, between the global South and the global North, and we confronted these power relations. We did this through a number of autonomous organizations which formed within the Wages for Housework campaign and reshaped it. It is a very unusual history, which you will soon be able to read about in Selma's second anthology, Our Time Is Now, Sex, Race, Class, and Caring for People and Planet, which is coming out in a couple of months. Now, these autonomous organizations were, first of all, Wages Due Lesbians, which is now called Queer Strike, then the English Collective of Prostitutes, which also started in the US as the New York Collective and then became US Prostitutes Collective and works with Empower, very closely with Empower in Thailand. Then in the 80s, there was Winvisible, which is an organization of women with visible and invisible disabilities, again, bringing together sectors that were not brought together at all at the time. Now, crucially, Black Women for Wages for Housework had formed in New York and in England in 1975. And Margaret Prescott, who was supposed to speak today, but she lives in Los Angeles, so it was 2 o'clock in the morning, was a bit difficult for her, as you can imagine. So I've had to replace her. But Margaret Prescott was one of the founders of Black Women for Wages for Housework. And they work with the massive welfare rights movement in the US, which was led by Black single mothers. Some of you may have heard of Johnny Tillman, who had already demanded wages for women in the home and for the work that women do in the home. So Wages for Housework was very much rooted in the welfare rights movement in the US and in the movement for family allowances in the UK. You may know about Eleanor Rathbone, who was an independent MP in Britain, who fought for family allowance, for money in mothers' hands on the grounds that it was the best way to deal with child poverty but also that women had earned that right, the right to that money, and that women had earned the right to be independent from men for the work they were doing for the whole of society. And she won in 1946, 1945, then implemented in 46, family allowance, which is now known as child benefit. Much, much smaller than what she wanted, but nevertheless, a really important first step for all of us. So we were rooted in the welfare rights movement, and we were rooted in family allowance in this country. Now, not everyone was happy with anti-racism being at the very heart of our campaigning. And predictably, not long after Black Women for Wages for Housework was formed, the New York group, which had been white, dissolved, and it was then followed by the Italian groups, which worked closely with New York. And I have to say that this was a different Italy from what it is now. It was before the massive migrations of people from Africa and elsewhere, which have transformed Europe much for the better. Now, Black Women for Wages for Housework flourished, and in 1977, the very first year that the New York committee dissolved, they were part of a delegation, a grassroots delegation with the welfare rights organizers, to the first congressionally mandated National Women's Conference in Houston, Texas. I don't know if any of you followed the Netflix Mrs. America, which were not mentioned. There is no Black Women for Wages for Housework in it. And the welfare resolution that was won there by the Wages for Housework campaign is not mentioned. And it said that women's poverty must be the priority, and that welfare should be called a wage. And that was an astonishing victory at the time, which brought together women from all the different delegations, including the racist South. You know, the white women from the racist South were happy to back it, working with Black women. So it was a tremendous victory. And we believe that it delayed welfare cuts. I think you may know something about welfare reform in the US, which has been horrendous and has also led to the criminalization of Black people generally, and massive impoverishment. But we believe that that resolution delayed welfare reform by 20 years. Now, this success was followed by 15 years of organizing at the UN during the Women's Decade and subsequent conferences. In 1980, we won the ILO figure that women do 2/3 of the world's work for 5% of the income. And that was really a breakthrough, because that for the first time quantified the enormity of the contribution that women were making, mostly in unwaged work, in caring, reproductive work, and what little care we had in return. In 1985, there was another path-breaking recognition of unwaged work in the home, on the land, and in the community, which was agreed by government. And in 1995, I was in Nairobi, 1995 in Beijing, that agreement was more pinned down as to how it was supposed to be implemented. And it said that governments had to measure all this unwaged work and had to include its value in national accounts. They call them satellite accounts. Now, to win this, we had mobilized women from our whole international network. We had a petition, Women Can't Count Women's Work, which was signed by over 1,200 international organizations representing millions of women worldwide. And we also had, from 1975, when we had done a film called All Work and No Pay with the BBC Open Door program, we had given publicity to the Iceland women's strike, which happened in 1975 and which hardly anybody knew anything about. It had received practically no international coverage, despite the fact that it was the first general strike in Iceland. Because when the women could not work, it was very hard for the men to work. And you had TV presenters with the children sitting on their laps. Now, we went on to mark the anniversaries of the Iceland women's strike in order to make all the work that women were doing, which was invisible, visible, by organizing time-off events every 24th of October, including at Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp. We had a time-off there, which was, with a whole set of women who had been camping against cruise missiles, which we were also part of. So, just to tell you a little bit more about Beijing and how we won that victory, we had a big delegation from a whole set of different countries from the global south and the global north. And we held vigils outside the contact group that was discussing our resolution, our paragraph. They go on about paragraph. And we had one of us was part of the CARICOM of the Guyana delegation. And she was actually negotiating with governments what that paragraph should say. And she was in and out of the contact room, coming back and forth to discuss with Selma and Margaret whether the wording they were proposing was acceptable or not, going back in and saying, no, we won't have this, we need something better. And in the end, we got what we wanted. And that's how the United Nations finally agreed that all the unwaged work that women in particular are doing in the home, on the land, in the community had to be quantified, measured, quantified, and its value included in satellite account. It was a fantastic moment. I was there, many of us were there, and it was really exciting. And I have to say that Article 88 of the Bolivarian Constitution in Venezuela, which I edited a book about that, about how they did that, which recognizes housewives as productive and entitles housewives to Social Security, comes directly out of the victory of the UN. There's a book by Andai here, who was the person I just referred to in the contact group. And this is the point, is to change the world. And she tells that story at the UN. This book was out this year. Sadly, Andai is no longer with us. Now, we had expected that getting recognition for unwaged work, getting a measure of it, that it would actually make it easier for us to win the money that we deserve for doing this work, because we are serious about wages for housework. For us, it's not just some theory. For us, it's cash in women's hands, cash in mothers' hands who do most of this work, but in all the women who are doing caring work. And frankly, most women are doing caring work in one form or another, and also men. And we have a network of men called Payday within the Wages for Housework campaign, who share our perspective and who very much think that caring has to be at the center of economic and all policies. Now, however, this victory did not lead, or has not led yet, to money in women's hands, because there was quite strong opposition among feminists in government, in academia, and again, also the left. And so they have made it harder for us to win the money that we believe that mothers, women who are doing this work are entitled to. They have never been interested in what state money in women's hands would mean for grassroots women, how it would transform their lives, how it would end poverty. That has not been their concern. Their concern has been their own careers, and in many ways, they have been our main opposition. We're very glad there's going to be a debate on Saturday, to go through these issues. But we in the Wages for Housework campaign never gave up. we knew that grassroots women everywhere were with us, just like we had been and were with welfare mothers. In 2000, we launched a global women's strike after our sisters in Ireland asked us to support their call for a national strike. They thought, there's a new millennium, we're calling for a national strike, will you support us? We thought, great, let's make it international. And in fact, in 1999 in New York, we were at the UN for a meeting, we had a big meeting there, and we said, 8 March 2000, let's have a global women's strike. Let's show the world all the work that women are doing and put forward our demands. And the first demand was precisely for women to get a living wage for this work. Now, the strike was a tremendous success then. About 60 countries took part, highlighting in various ways, the women's contribution to the economy and to life generally. Now, since then, we have continued to build an international network, which is very difficult to do. There are a lot of people who have international contacts. There are a lot of people who know a lot of people, but to work as an international network, which is mutually accountable between different sectors and different countries and different languages, is very difficult. It is also enormously rewarding. Now, it includes groups of domestic workers organizing in Trinidad and in Peru. In fact, Trinidad from 1980 joined the Wages for Housework campaign, the National Union of Domestic Employees, who absolutely felt that this was her perspective as somebody who was organizing low-income workers, both domestic workers and also in a chicken factory. We have a group in Chhattisgarh. We work with women in Chhattisgarh, India, Dalit and tribal women who have been campaigning against bonded labor, against rape by landlord, a whole set of fantastic organizing. And as I said, we have a sex worker organization, both in England, in the US, and also in Thailand. And in Thailand also, a women human rights collective, which is very active in all kinds of ways and which is now working closely with the strike. And in Ireland, we do have an academic. You'll be glad to know that there's hope for academics, and I'm very glad today. I'm sure there's a number of academics who are on our side and who we can now work with. And she has been organizing for pay equity across the whole university. That is not only lecturers, but admin staff, cleaners, everyone, and also with students. So she's definitely breaking new ground. And Ireland has a constitution which recognizing the work of women in the home. And we're trying to amend that. We can tell you more about that later. Now, we also work across the Caribbean to oppose coups and occupation in Haiti. And it's a very dire situation, which I won't get into, but if people are interested, again, women have been, raped and murdered, and the US has been interfering as it does in a number of countries around the world. And in the US, our campaign there is at the moment pushing very hard for a kind of child benefit. It's a child tax allowance, but it's like a child benefit because it will go to everyone. And also for a bill that will redefine work to include caregiving in the family and also studying. And that will end the kind of witch hunt against welfare mothers and against people with disabilities and everyone on welfare that has been going on for decades. And as you mentioned, we are part of the Green New Deal for Europe, and I'm coming to an end, you'll be glad to know. And we are, together with the Green New Deal for Europe, putting forward a care income. There is an open letter, which we hope you will circulate and get signatures for. And I think the care income is kind of an update of Wages for Housework, in the sense that it brings together the caring work for people, for the environment, and for the natural world. And at this moment in time, that should always have been the case, but at this moment in time, with what we know about the climate emergency and the urgency of saving the planet if we want to save ourselves, that has to be a priority. We have women's centers, and of course in the third world, especially on the countryside, we know that they're the same thing. We've always known that. If you have a subsistence farm, you know that your care for your farm and for your environment and for the natural world around you and the survival of the family are one and the same thing. And a lot of the groups in Thailand are doing precisely that work on the land. Now we have women's centers in a number of cities. In London is the Crossroads Women's Centre in Kentish Town, from which we campaign against deportation, destitution of asylum seekers, rape, domestic violence, against benefit cuts, against people with disabilities and cuts generally, and also, as you mentioned, against children being unjustly removed from their mothers just because they're poor or they're women of color or they have a disability or they somehow need some form of support, and what they get instead and to have their children taken from them, or they're victims of domestic violence and then the state blames the mother rather than the perpetrator. And we do all this work from the perspective of wages for housework, that is, of organizing across sectors in a way that undermines the power hierarchy within our movement, and of demanding that caring, that the survival and well-being of people, of the environment, of the natural world must be the economic and political priority in everything. Now, we know now that unless that happens, the world will not survive. So we are talking about the need really to win wages for housework now as really a survival strategy for all of us. We call it a care income now, but it is wages for housework. And if you start with women at the bottom, if you start with the majority of us who are doing all this huge amount of unwaged work, we can have a great movement and we can win, and we very much need to. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nina. Our next speaker is Devaki. I have lost Devaki. Devaki, are you there? Devaki?
Yeah, she's on the call.
She's on the call, but she's shut her video. Shall we move to Rohini? Rohini, are you there? Rohini?
Yeah. I'm here. You sure you do? What's happening to Devaki? Okay.
I think we are running late as well, so I think let Devaki return. Okay. Let's start with Rohini. So for those who may not know, Rohini is a very well-known figure in Indian feminist and left circles. She's a writer, independent scholar, activist, written extensively on labor rights. Her book, Workers' Unions and Global Capitalism, is very well known in the field. She's written on feminism, minority rights, globalization, struggles for democracy. She has also written 2 novels inspired by her work. Rohini.
Thank you. Well, I've called my presentation Wages for Housework in India with a question mark. Okay, now from what I've read of the writings of Selma James, Maria Rosa Dalla Costa, and Silvia Federici, I feel they have made a really important contribution to Marxist theory with their insight that the unwaged domestic labor of working class housewives produces labor power, which is the most crucial commodity in a capitalist society, the foundation on which the rest of the economy is built. I came across their 1972 argument that housework and caring work done in the home actually produce value only in the 1980s. But in 1977, I independently came to the same conclusion by subjecting all of Marx's writing on the production of labor power to a rigorous critique. I showed that his writings were inconsistent and contradicted the theory of value whenever he left out domestic labor from a calculation of the value of labor power, which is what is hired out to capitalists in return for a wage. As I found out when I revisited the domestic labor debate more recently, this is still not a widely accepted position, namely that it contributes to the value of labor power, despite the fact that it is undoubtedly correct. So the Wages for Housework campaigners were way ahead of their time. Their contention that domestic labor also produces surplus value needs to be fine-tuned a little. Obviously, if surplus value is defined as Marx does, as being produced by wage labor performed directly for capital, then it is not produced by housework. However, domestic labor can definitely enable the capitalist to extract more surplus value from workers by subsidizing the production of labor power. The Bolivian miner's wife and activist Domitila Barrios de Chungara demonstrated this by calculating how much it would cost a miner to buy the services performed by his wife on the market, and found that it came to more than what he earned in a month. We have also found in India that when real wages fall due to rising prices, housewives, including women who also perform wage labor outside the home, have to spend more time and effort on unwaged domestic labor. This suggests that labor power is produced by the entire working class household, not just by wage earners whose pay buys the raw materials, because they then need to be cooked in the home, which also needs to be maintained and cleaned and so on. It also underlines the fact that the price of labor power can be pushed down, not only by reducing wages, but also by extending working hours, not just in the workplace, but also in the home. In the Indian context, where many working class women spend inordinate amounts of time queuing up at public water taps or wells and carrying water home, in some cases collecting firewood for cooking and so on, domestic labor helps employers to push wages down below the value of labor power. Now, this underscores the political importance of the Wages for Housework campaign, because those who deny that unwaged domestic labor contributes to the value of labor power are effectively helping employers to underpay their workers. However, I find many practical problems if we take the demand literally. For those who are doing full-time caring for small children or a disabled family member, it wouldn't be difficult to argue that they should get paid for it, in addition to the allowance for the children and the disabled person. But how do you measure other tasks? And if the state is going to pay, will they come and inspect you to see that you are doing the work properly, keeping your home clean, etc.? What if the housework is shared? Will the wage be shared too? Other demands like the right to choose whether or when to have children, accessible childcare, decent affordable housing, leisure time, green spaces, and so on, are easier to envisage fighting for. A major weakness of the campaign, I feel, is its failure to challenge the gender division of labor. Despite the fact that apart from childbearing and breastfeeding, all the other tasks done at home can be done by people of any gender. Perhaps they fear that raising the issue might cause unpleasant conflict in the family. But unless it is confronted, domestic labor will never be properly recognized or compensated. In my opinion, only when everyone performs housework and caring work Will it be recognized as essential for reproducing labor power from one day to the next and one generation to the next, and therefore an essential part of the working day? The logical conclusion is that hours spent in waged work need to be reduced without any reduction in pay in order to pay for domestic labor. We had various discussions touching on unwaged domestic labor in Bombay. In one basti, the women made an exhibition asking why it was that when a male tailor stitched or mended clothes outside the home, he was paid, whereas a woman who did the same work at home was not. Why male cooks and waiters in a restaurant were paid, while women doing the same work at home were not, and so on and so forth. This made the important point that despite employing the same skills and performing the same work, women engaged in domestic labor were unwaged, while men working outside the home were waged. One idea they discussed was to take some of the work outside the home by forming cooperatives to set up neighborhood laundries, community kitchens, etc. In another basti where we carried out a survey of women's waged and unwaged work, at the end of it, the women said, "Now that we've answered all your questions, what are you going to do for us?" Their demand was that we help them set up an income-generating project. Since our meager research grant had run out and we had no money, the first thing we suggested was making patchwork baby quilts and stuffed toys out of the bits of cloth thrown away by tailors and garment units. So we got it free. So the women collected the tukade, cut out the toys from patterns in a children's book, stitched the quilts and toys, and stuffed the toys. We had the difficult work of marketing them. When all our friends and contacts and their friends and contacts had bought quilts and toys, we moved on to producing a weaning food for small children, made from local grains and having the same nutritional value as the much more expensive commercial manufactured baby foods. This had the advantage of being consumed so that we could sell again to the same customers, but we still couldn't jack up sales to a level where the women got a reasonable income. It's important to note that in addition to doing fairly heavy unwaged labor, sometimes with help from daughters and other family members, these women were also doing waged labor, mostly domestic work in nearby apartments. And still, they were so desperately in need of money that they wanted more work. They were willing to use the skills they had to earn it, but didn't want to take on the task of marketing their products, even within their own basti. The huge problem of unemployment and underemployment of the men in their families has only got worse under the present government. By contrast, women workers in large-scale pharmaceutical, food, and personal products factories were earning much higher wages. One of their big problems, especially for women in factories where they were still working a 48-hour week, was time. Almost all of them had to go home after a hard day's work and do another stint of domestic labor. And their only day off was also swallowed up by housework. They had no leisure, no time to themselves, not even enough time for rest and sleep, except during holidays. This is where it would have made a big difference if men too were doing a shift at home, because then they would never have accepted such long working hours. And many more trade unions would have had to take up shorter working hours as a demand. We also had some fascinating conversations with these women about the gender division of labor. Back in the 1960s, women in the pharmaceutical factories had fought against the marriage bar and for equal wages. Later, they fought for maternity benefits and workplace nurseries for their preschool children. Since both were provided by the employer, it became more expensive to employ women. Employers retaliated by ceasing to recruit women whose numbers were shrinking rapidly by the time we spoke to them. Another reason why their numbers were declining is that they were concentrated in so-called semi-skilled jobs, which were the most likely to disappear with automation. So there was a gender division of labor in the workplace too. Most of them felt that women had a right to have a decent job, try their hand at more skilled jobs, and have provision for a family too. Asked whether men should also be able to bring their small children to the nursery and should get paternity leave on the birth of a child, there were some differences of opinion, but most women thought they should. Sadly, in the decade after we did this research, almost all the factories where we had met the women shut down and shifted production to smaller units or units in greenfield sites where they didn't have to grant the same rights to workers. Bombay was shattered by anti-Muslim pogroms, leading to ghettoization. The labor codes rammed through during the COVID pandemic take away the rights won by formal sector workers. But the problems of working class women have, if anything, become more urgent and still cry out for solutions. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Rohini. That was a very interesting presentation and raising a couple of rather complicated issues. And thank you for bringing that up. Now we have Devaki with us. Devaki is, I think, one of those people for whom the cliche of she needs no introduction is in fact true. Economist, honorary fellow, St. Anne's College, Oxford, former director, Institute of Social Studies Trust in New Delhi. That is her formal introduction. Pioneering Indian feminists who we have all grown up reading. Her very recent memoirs, The Brass Notebook, has made waves already. And we have also seen her other book, Journey of a Southern Feminist. Very happy to have you with us today, Devaki. 15 minutes. Devaki, you need to unmute. Devaki, unmute, please. Yeah.
Can you hear us?
Yes.
You can hear me now?
Yes, Devaki.
Oh, okay, lovely.
Devaki, we can't see you though.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Oh, I think she's left the meeting by mistake. I think she will be back. Maybe Shamita, we can.
Yeah.
Maybe we can move on till she comes back on.
Her screen sharing is still there. We are watching her PPT.
Yes, that I have uploaded. Oh, she's back.
Oh, she's there.
Yeah.
Shall I? Is somebody admitting her? Yeah.
Yes, I've admitted her.
You got it?
Devaki?
Okay. Yeah,
Devaki.
I'm ready. Just wondering whether you can hear me, that's all.
Yeah, we can hear you now. Go ahead.
So I want to thank Prabha for pulling some of us out of our caves, our less visible places that we now occupy. It's a great opportunity for people like me, 1975 vintage, to come back into circulation and converse, debate with people like you. In a rather tricky way, I want to thank the person I call Lady Corona. I've started calling this pandemic Lady Corona just to make it lighthearted. But my journalist son scolded me for giving her this status when she had been so evil. But we have to thank Lady Corona for these opportunities because imagine the same group being invited for the discussion in earlier times. It would require Prabha to raise an enormous amount of funds, book places in London or in Delhi, pay for boarding and lodging and for conference, and then the mics and everything. Now, meetings like ours are enabled by Lady Corona because we have taken to Zoom, which perhaps will now remain a technique for all of us in the future. Zoom has also meant denial. For example, we cannot go off to Finland or to Turkey to debate our ideas, but have to do it from a desktop or a laptop in our own rooms and houses. So boring. We are like housewives. Should we get wages per diem that we could have got if the seminar was in London for working on a seminar from our homes? It is therefore a sense of deprivation too to be able to do this whole thing on webinar. But for people of my age, it's a celebration because this is much easier for us than flying across continents. I know I'm taking time to say this while there's a shortage of time, but it's also to thank Prabha for including me in this conversation and hoping that others will continue this tradition of pulling people out from their caves, old people like us, and putting them in touch with those who are right now on the track because we learn. On this question of wages for housework, Selma Jones and I had a quarrel in the 1970s. In those days, there was no telephone or any of the instruments of communication that we have now, like internet. So one would hear about, say, an idea, and I would raise my disagreement in every meeting that I went to, either in India or abroad, disagreeing with the idea of wages for housework. Now, what was that disagreement? At the time, we in India were trying to ensure that women workers in the conventional understanding of work, that is adding to gross domestic product in terms of physical outputs and services, who were not included, should be recognized. This non-inclusion meant that they had no particular wage structure, no determined wage, no other benefits of being employed. I think this distinction of being employed with all the labor statutes that go with it was a value. But then belonging to that kind of domain of work but not being recognized was, I thought, one of the greater challenges and also deprivations. So there were women who were picking cotton or weeding fields or threshing paddy and doing so many other tasks which enabled the building of the finished product, but who are not considered to be workers. And therefore, there was no minimum wage fixed for them, no labor law was claimed. Since there were so many women in this category who needed to be identified, who needed to be brought on the labor laws, it seemed far-fetched to make a call for the recognition of those who were not necessarily in that category of productive work to be included for a wage. So that was the major difference between us. While it seemed legitimate to reveal that they were laboring, that women were laboring in the house, and it was a worthwhile contribution. But in my mind, the prior concern or priority was to first include those who belong to the conventional definition of worker from the point of view of contributing to the conventional GDP. At least 40% of what is now called market work by women was not included. And I can give you many examples, but the examples would only show that they were being taken for granted. I think Esther Boserup also showed this kind of neglect of women who are actually farming but not counted as workers or farmers. So in my first attempt to explore this neglect in 1975, I undertook a time use survey of a carefully selected sample of households reflecting class and predominant features of agriculture. The hypothesis for the study was that women workers were underenumerated in the Indian Employment Survey called the NSSO in India. The methodology was to record activities through observation, recording time they spent on different activities. We found that many of the tasks in which women were engaged actually added to the conventional product, but were not visible, not counted. Why would be one interested in getting that task done, the counting? First, once you identify this as work leading to the conventional GDP, then one can claim a wage structure, a minimum wage for the task, and come under labor laws. Let me illustrate. A study funded by the FAO that we did of women gathering barks, leaves, and berries in the forest, we found the task is called free collection of goods. And those products are called minor forest products. There's no price fixed for them, no wages for the gatherers. The women then sold these berries and barks that they gathered at completely exploitative prices to tradesmen, who then sold it or made medicines from herbal and other natural resources. By not recognizing them as workers, by not recognizing their product as an economic product, they were actually exploited. In the same way, there are many other such tasks that women did which were not visible or recognized as work in the conventional sense, and therefore there was neither a wage nor any cover of labor legislation, including protection against health hazards. So you can see this was our preoccupation, and that is where I had to fall out with the wages for housework leader. The second example I would like to give is silkworm rearing. I don't know how many of you know that the cocoons are raised in small shacks in trays, with the mulberry leaves being thrown in. Women have to tend these trays, which means first feeding them with mulberry leaf apparently every 3 hours, and then cleaning the offal that they generate every 6 hours. They are looked after more carefully than the children. So women are up all night feeding these little babies. The women and children sleep in the same shack in which the silkworms are being reared. This was both a health hazard as well as a non-recognition of work, as the cocoons, once they are ready, are sold in the market by the men. They are boiled, and from it comes the silk yarn from which we have the silk. The other process of spinning the cocoon into yarn are recognized and given a wage. But this rearing in the huts is not recognized as a task, demanding a wage or any other protective health cover. The women do not see themselves as workers, so would perhaps reply to an investigator they're doing housework. I can go on like this for many products. Preparation of carpets and Kashmir. Am I too fast?
Devaki, can you hear? I think it's frozen.
Yeah. Can you hear us?
I don't think she can. Devaki, can you hear us? What should we do? I think she's back. Hi, Devaki.
Have I come back?
Yeah, you've come back.
Okay. So what I'm trying to show illustrations of how women were doing work which should had a wage, should have health cover, but that was all considered to be housework. I can go on like this for many products. Preparation of carpets in Kashmir, where the women do all the threading. Filigree products in Orissa, where the women do all the pounding of the silver. So the processing before it is changed into the final product is actually a skill. It is not recognized, so it does not come under the cover of labor legislation. Therefore, my argument had been first things first. Let us get workers in our countries, especially women workers, in tedious, physically dangerous tasks attended to with both occupational identity, wage assistance, labor legislation before we start for asking the state to cover the tasks that women engage in looking after the household. Actually, we did a household survey also. We influenced the National Household Survey to separate household production from household chores. Household chores were what we all call the 3 Cs: cooking, cleaning, and childcare. Household production were the kind of items that women produce from the house, whether they are beadies, where they cut newspaper and make them into cheap envelopes, or string beads. This was household production and was usually sold by the women to brokers. These tasks were often not given a name or a number. This, by giving them a name and a number, we led to unionization and wage fixation even for this household production. In these ways, we were hoping that women's economic contribution could be made visible before we come to paying her or recognizing her work in what is called the 3 Cs, that is, housework. So when Selma came up with wages for housework, even though in those days we had no telephone or wire connection, I will confess that I mocked it. I said this can only happen in rich countries where women are really recognized in their wage work and are suffering from lack of domestic help. And therefore, this is a compensation for otherwise what we have in the developing countries, which is a great, huge flood of women who are willing to do domestic work for you, sometimes for a pittance. So the contrasting of the scenario which we in the former colonies represented compared to what could be the scenario in what used to be called the advanced economies is what made me uncomfortable with the wages for housework movement. Let me also say that in those days, politically, we were not necessarily bothered with what the white countries' women were saying or doing. We had a sense of they can ask for what they want, but we are not in that scene. We are not like them, to put it very crudely. I would say this was a very strong political affirmation in the 70s and 80s, and I think by the end of the 90s, you had emails and so on, and the communications and the solidarities changed. The UN, which I've often complained about, started to choose themes which were more from where the pressures came from, which I argue were the white countries. I mean, Sweden and even Eastern European and Latin American countries, talking of unpaid work which had to be paid. These things came up in the UN's blackboard, much to the discomfort of many of us who felt that the UN was falling prey to the dominance of the northern countries, the former empire. Turning to today, I'm finding it's not only interesting, but mesmerizing and intoxicating to exchange and engage with African feminist debates. The African continent has sort of rebirthed itself in terms of feminist intellectualism. Earlier, I do not think there was that much writing, but currently people like Sylvia Tamale, with her book Decolonization and Afrofeminism, challenge every norm, every descriptive category that of any kind that is coming from the outside. I feel a sense of identity with that kind of voice because terminology is such an important tool. Many of the terms in English to describe phenomena that we see on the ground in our countries do damage, if not destroy the reality. In fact, I have a table which echoes the vocabulary of oppression, and that is how a word, a term used to describe a phenomenon, then determines the whole packet behind it. But if you change the term, then the perception and thereby the analysis and therefore the changes will change. Let me give you a few examples and stop. For example, converting these terms to our dialect. For current, home, read workplace. If the home is defined as a workplace, then all these problems of wage, work from home will come. Take informal sector. We call it the first sector, as most of our workers in that category. Why do we call it informal? It is the first sector, and therefore we call attention to it as a different kind of category in our countries. Subsistence, we call it self-reliance. The new word would be self-reliance. Why do you call this is a self-reliant economy? Seclusion can be called female socialization because there's a stigma in saying seclusion. But if you say female socialization, the stigma is removed. Decentralization, why call it decentralization? Call it localization. Localization is a much more powerful word. Home-based work could be called household enterprise. So again, you have a change in language and vocabulary can make a difference to how you perceive an economic phenomenon. So this is a dissenting voice, if you call it that, but a dissenting voice which is not able to put forward a format, a theory, a well-researched paper which supports the voice as I am now out of the game. But I just wanted to throw these thoughts into this pool. And surely those of you who are deeply engaged with the theoretical and the empirical part of the story of this subject would have more to say and to provide to this debate than I have. So thank you, Prabha, for bringing me out of the cave, and I look forward to the rest of the debates. Thank you.
Thank you, Devaki, from bringing back the decolonizing voice. So we now move to Lalita. Lalita, are you there? Can you hear me?
Yes, I'm here. How do I make myself visible? I don't know.
Put on your video.
Yes, 1 minute. Yeah, yeah.
So again, I mean, Lalita, a very familiar figure in the Indian feminist and left circles. She is co-author and editor of the most famous book in Indian women's writing, We Were Making History, and co-editor of Women Writing in India, also Rupture, Loss and Living. She was founder president of the Progressive Organization of Women and founder coordinator and president of Anniversaries Research Center of Women's Studies. Very pleased to have you with us today, Lalita. Please, 15 minutes.
Thank you, Shramita. I mean, thanks for having me on this panel, and I'm really privileged, and not as much as what that Devaki was saying, but even I feel like I've been living in a shell for some time. And so my task, as I understood in the little discussion we had the other day, is to recapture certain experiences and the way we understood certain concepts and the influences that we have seen in our lives as activists in 70s and 80s, importantly. I'm saying 70s and 80s because that period, the context was very different from what we are today in. Though several problems have become much worse, not better, but they were slightly different. Now, I just wanted to share some of the experiences, like as you mentioned in the introduction, the Progressive Organization of Women, POW, somewhere in the women's movement histories, it's mentioned as the first feminist young women's group in India. I was the president of that group. And in the university, as a student body and as young women's body, when we started, how we were influenced with what kind of politics and what was the feminist understanding, what was the Marxist understanding, how we viewed ourselves as socialist feminists. Though today I would not use these very boxed in kind of categories, but those days that is how we viewed ourselves in. And we, in our kind of conceptual understanding, not only the feminist literature that was very popular at that time and for several decades later, like Betty Friedan, Jem Greer, and all these were the works we were studying and were very, very influenced by all that. And at the same time, we were also influenced by Marxism, Marxist theory, studying the lives of Rosa Luxemburg and Clara Zetkin and socialist revolution, Chinese revolution, very importantly. So these were the influences. But talking about the topic today, wages for housework, I would also like to see it as a perspective that we kept dealing with and understanding and studying and debating and writing and working with, rather than focusing on a mobilization issue, like mobilizing people towards, this kind of demand, whether against factory managements or formal sector or government institutions or whatever. That was not I think the first speaker with the international perspective, Lopez, was mentioning that it was more a perspective than a demand. That is how it was in 70s and also much later in 80s. What I would like to dwell upon more is this kind of understanding. How did we develop about housework? Because I come from a region, this Andhra Telangana region, where this Telangana armed struggle had happened, and that was led by a Communist Party of India. One of the I think it was a main armed struggle that has happened in the 40s and early 50s in this region. That is the background from where many of us come from, and we have taken those influences into our lives, and that is how more or less we got into activism along with this feminist thinking. So that explains the reason for the socialist understanding. And as POW, what were the issues we were dealing with? Definitely not demanding wages for housework, but very importantly, viewing women's work not as divided as housework and work outside the home, because most of the poorer women, women belonging to the towns and cities and working in the unorganized sector, we have seen their lives being involved in several types of economic activities, not just sticking to one profession. I'm talking about the unorganized sector, not the formal sector. So in a year's time, or through different seasons, or even on a daily basis, women did several things to cope. This was a coping mechanism, and as a main supporters and providers for the family. Now, this understanding came from all these influences, very importantly, but also from viewing the activity from the ground level experience. What do I mean by that? So far, our understanding at that time was male as the breadwinner, men as the main income earners for the family. This experience has completely changed that for us. So not only women became the main supporters of the family in terms of bringing food for the table or onto the plate, and this understanding went on to look at even later when we were an organized women's middle class women's organizations focusing on issues of violence, domestic violence, direct violence, psychological violence. We could see that something is happening there. Sorry. Yeah. We could feel that, the understanding that one had a classical understanding of a worker-capitalist relationship would not hold water if we have to look at the women's work. This was an important understanding we had. And the late 70s, there was a study which I participated in, and also the books that we as a group were reading, is this Domitila Chungara's book, which I think Rohini was mentioning, if I remember right. And this book was a very big influence on us, because the housework, very first time we have seen how housework has been debated, and how it was calculated as an economic value. So far, we understood only bonded labor or the rural unorganized sections, working as free labor in this region that I come from. It was called Vetti Chakiri. But what women did very importantly, not just for the household, but even outside working in unorganized sector, is that kind of Vetti Chakiri. That is that free labor, which combined several aspects of this kind of work. So how do you differentiate? And the other influence which worked on us as a group and more as an individual for me is my work with Maria Mies, this sociologist, feminist, who worked on a International Labour Organization project looking at women's lives in the subsistence sector. Subsistence sector, not just agriculture, but also the household and cottage industries. Can you hear me?
Yeah. We can hear you, Lalita. Do go on.
Oh, sorry. Suddenly the video disappeared, so I just got confused. Yeah, so this project, which resulted in a couple of books, working on books on lace workers of Narsapur, a household cottage industry, where women actually produced sitting at their homes for the world market. And 90% of the state's income from exporting came from this sector at that time. Now, looking at their lives and looking at we understood concepts like invisibilization of women's work. It's not just the domestic work, but even economic kind of activity which provided very importantly for the family was work that was invisible to the family and to the middlemen and to the producers and to the exporters. They said they do it like a hobby. This is a household kind of a thing which women like to do. It's knitting, it's crocheting, and they're, working for in their leisure time activity. These are all the concepts that I understood at that time very importantly. And any one of us experiencing reading texts or books on all these concepts have fed back into the group, which also influenced the group's thinking much later, even in the other feminist group that I have been part of, which is that Sri Shakti Sangatana in early 80s. In 80s, what we did was not to take up these issues to demand that women should be paid wages for work, either from the unorganized sector or the factory managements or the state as such, but to raise a political kind of a debate and a discourse based on these issues. And we prepared a lot of activities like street theater. We made a film on psychological, domestic kind of violence. Violence was a main issue feminists were focusing on all over the country at that time. Now, I think somebody also made this point that women's movement or the feminist movement being more middle class oriented, they could not actually see or relate to the working class or the poorer women's issues of work in their own homes and outside, and how their life actually went on as a continuation in that care industry and providing for the older people, the sick people, for the children, for the families, fetching water, fetching firewood in the rural areas and in the urban areas as such. But I actually would like to differ with that understanding of the feminist movement, because though I agree that we came from middle classes and upper caste most importantly, but I want to say at this juncture, I would like to say that most of the middle classes, even in the 80s until 90s, maybe even till 2000, like 2 decades back, maybe things have changed, but there was not that much money in the economy. There was not that much that women could afford to pay for the domestic labor and then go out and be workers or working class people or the teachers, doctors, professionals, various things that women were doing. We all did housework. We did everything at home. We worked on our jobs and we were trying to be activists and being, 3 different full-time jobs we were handling. Now comes the question, why was there not a political demand about housework? This is a very interesting point I think we all need to debate and grapple with, because is it because we were middle class that we did not want to look at it? You always prioritize issues. You can't look at everything and make a public activity focus on every issue that you come across in life. So what you do is that you pick and choose within the framework. But in your consciousness raising activity, there are a lot of articles being written on housework. There are a lot of programs being conducted with teachers and training of teachers, courses happening, academic staff colleges. We were going on with this concept. So I think it was a combination of several things that were happening. For example, early part of 80s, I remember we all as a group worked on a film about domestic violence, which was not a direct physical kind of violence, but a psychological aspects of that violence within the family, which meant very importantly the three-way burden on women to carry without any help or support. Now, when we demand wages for any work at all, it also should not end up in a way that we demand some kind of a compensation from the state, which becomes more like a part of a welfare state understanding rather than a political right. So giving a political edge to these issues was very important for us as feminists and women's groups in our country, and not to make it like only an economic kind of a demand. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood when I say economic demand, because women in our country, and not just women, but even men, like Dalits and minorities and other marginal sections, nobody gets a fair pay or a full pay or equal pay for equal kind of work because of their caste, identities, or communities, or even religion, like minorities in our country. So when a political context is this fragmented and this complicated, how do you develop a demand for wage for housework? Is a honest kind of complexity I have in my mind, which I want to put in front of you. How do we do that? Because suppose we are saying like universal basic income that we are talking about today, and if this can be part of that universal basic income debate as well about housework, how do we view that? Would it be again asking for 1,500 rupees a month for a woman within the family for the work she does? Would it be making a demand on the state of that nature? And wouldn't it become a demand which will lose its political edge and again get reduced to a reform kind of a activity? Like we have all these pensions that are being paid to people. Would it be another demand like that? This is my honest kind of admission of my confusion in my mind. But I would say that in India, very importantly, all these political questions that like women's movement has raised about women's lives, they have that political edge, which has been picked up by the left parties, the left movements and NGOs and many other political groups that are functioning today. Without that kind of articulation and concentration that happened in very importantly 70s, 80s and 90s, we wouldn't have arrived at this. I wouldn't have arrived at this understanding today. And the region I come from, there is a kind of a very interesting experiment women and Dalit groups and transgender groups have taken up in the last few years, irrespective of political factions and fragments that people belong to, women belonging to different political parties, different ML groups, CPI, CPM, various hues of left parties, and transgender groups and the Dalit groups. They are all together under one umbrella, raising many of these issues, not just of violence or demanding human rights or civil liberties, but very importantly, oppression, sexual oppression, transgender and LGBT kind of issues as well as the poorer women in the informal sector, which is growing enormously today, the both rural and urban sections, bringing all these issues together. That's what they are trying to do. I don't know whether
you're out of time, Lalita. If you just wrap up, please.
Yes. So I just wanted to say as a conclusion, I don't know how much of what I talked today will feed into the discussion about wages for housework. And I know that in the concept note, I have seen Kamala Hassan's party raising this issue. I mean, political parties which are coming up have to think of something sensationalizing. I don't know whether there is any serious kind of engagement politically with these kind of questions that parties like, I don't have that much faith. But if it is raising a debate, it's very good that we capture. And I would like to submit at the end of my presentation that this today we have in India the complexity of identity issues and Dalit movement and minorities and tribal groups, everybody demanding their issues to be brought to the forefront. And also, mind you, in 90s there was a huge kind of discussion among the feminist groups with various other groups which I have mentioned already, coming in questioning the women's movement for being upper caste and middle class, not raising several issues which pertain very importantly to the Dalit and minority groups. I want to close it there saying we've learned by being open-minded, by listening on to everyone's demands. So I feel that either dumping each other or accusing each other of not being concerned about other people will not take us very far, is what I would like to submit. Thank you very much for giving this opportunity.
Thank you, Lalita. This has been a very interesting account of various challenges that women's movement in India has faced in the course of this period where we have encountered and conversed with the Wages for Housework movement. We are running very late. There is very little time left. If I were to speak for 15 minutes, there would be no time for discussion. So I will very briefly flag 3 issues that have emerged from these various presentations, but that I also wish to contribute to the debate. And then we'll open it up for only a few questions that we'll have time for. So I think the most important issue that we have taken forward. So Devaki, I think, very clearly flagged the entanglement of production and reproduction in the way work is organized in countries like South Asia. So there is no clear separation of the work women do even at home. What is for trade, what is subsistence, what is actually housework. And these are categories we impose on work, whereas work itself is a more amorphous range of activities that women undertake, the vast majority of women in our country. And this has been an issue that has been flagged from different directions by theorists over the last 30 years. So if we begin with the Geeta Sen, Lutz Benaria kind of intervention, they pointed out that the Boserup framework has to be complicated by a view from the global south. If we look at Maria Mies, who Lalita has mentioned, their work, their book, Last Colony, Claudia von Werhoff, as well as Veronica Benholt-Thompson, they have argued that the Marxist dual framework of capitalist and wage labor should be further complicated by a third term, which is subsistence work. So if you have to include the post-colonial and developing countries, then some of the theoretical frameworks developed in the West have to be revisited and rethought. Now, in that context, these drawing very much from Rosa Luxemburg's also framework of enlarged reproduction, how do you think of reproduction as the outside? If the housewife is the outside to capitalism, then that is how do we incorporate that element into the framework? So I would argue that this brings us to understand and see that housework is not just a discrete set of activities. In the context of a country like India, domesticity is very much an ideology, and I don't think that is only in a country like India, that is in many countries, and that includes countries in the West. And we are seeing that now. I think today's situation in the West, it has changed quite significantly from what we have had in the 70s, particularly 80s. And we are seeing change more in the direction that we understand in the global South than in the 80s. And if we take those insights, I think the West today needs the insights from the last 30 years of work we have done in the global South. So one very important issue, I would say, is that housework is a capacious category, and housework is in that sense an imperialist category. It seeks to incorporate more and more activity into itself. And in fact, it is the unpaid character of housework, or the way in which it seeks to invisibilize work, is the reason why it grows more capacious. So to challenge, to merely say that we need wages for housework is I would argue, is a misunderstanding of the politics of housework. It is to make it unpaid that housework is a powerful category. And it works by that hegemonic intent. So in fact, we have to challenge what is housework rather than say we need wages for housework. And that understanding we have, if we look at what is housework, the definition of housework, the constitution of housework changes over time and place. So we do need far more historical inquiries into what is housework and what housework means in different contexts in order to understand this. So Devaki was pointing out how different kinds of activities, productive activities, can become housework. So it is by, in fact, making it housework and therefore not paying for it, that you make certain productions possible, certain productions. So not only capital, but patriarchy enables that work to be viable by making a component of it unpaid. So it is the participants, and it is an ideology, because I have done a great deal of fieldwork in Bengal's countryside in the last few years. And if you talk to women, women too will insist that it is housework. They will do nail making, they will do jute processing, clearly work that is for the market. But they do it within the context of the household, and they too believe that it is housework. So that is the hegemonic aspect of this ideology, and that is the aspect of it that we need to confront. So that, I think, is one set of problems: the elasticity of housework, the fact that it is an ideology, the fact that it is capacious. And the second, I think, issue that we must confront in the context of not only our countries, but also in the West now, paid domestic work is on the increase. So if we are asking for wages for housework, then we have to confront the issue of paid housework. Because it is only by differentiating paid and unpaid housework that we can think in terms of what wages for housework might constitute. And in the Indian context, there is another term that is floating around nowadays, which is called extra domestic work. Some economists have suggested this, and it constitutes, if I've understood it right, the kind of work that is domestic work, paid domestic work plus. So middle-class housewives who have paid domestic workers nevertheless do certain additional domestic work. And this is being called extra domestic work. We need to disentangle these different kinds of work and also understand, I think this is what the issue that wages for housework has not quite put on the table, whether there is a hierarchy of domestic work. Is there a hierarchy of work? Is domestic work a bundle of work which we can undifferentiatedly deal with? Or is there work within domestic work which has order? And if that is so, if there's superior domestic work, not so superior domestic work, how do we deal with the manual, what in India one would think of as menial content of domestic work? Then how do we differentiate within domestic work? And unless we look at the various fragmentations of the categories within domestic work, I don't think we can actually, we would be misled if we dealt with domestic work as a homogeneous, undifferentiated category. And here I would say we would have to add to the mix the problem of the double domesticity of the paid domestic worker. So the paid domestic worker who is doing domestic worker for wages also has domestic worker as unpaid domestic work of her own household. So we bring various, and given the fact that such a large proportion of women in the workforce in India are in fact engaged in paid domestic work, this is an issue that I don't think we can completely ignore. So there are issues of women workers and unpaid domestic work. There are issues of paid domestic work and unpaid domestic work. And these complications, I think, need to be factored in. Thank you. I will stop there. And I will now ask for questions. How, Prabha, are we doing questions?
I think you can collect a group of 3, perhaps, Shamita, and maybe 2 rounds with quick responses for those who want to respond, or if the questions are directed to them. We can't hear you.
Hi,
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So those who want to ask questions, you can put it in the chat if you like.
Yeah.
Or say in the chat that you want to ask a question. Or if you, is there an electronic hand here?
Yeah, they can raise their hands. Yeah.
Yeah, so you can either raise your hand or put it in the chat. Shraddha Jain, do you want to ask a question? Shraddha?
Yeah, hello.
Hi.
Hi, and thanks for the opportunity. First of all, I thank the organizers and speakers for this fascinating talk. I was thinking about 2 points. Like, I've been reading this book by John Tronton, Caring Democracy, which talks about bringing care in the political agenda. It's not only about who does it and who should be paid for it. It's bringing it care in the whole discussion. So I was curious to know how we bring in the care provision itself in along with this discussion on wages for housework, especially in India. Like, we have been listening you talking about the context specificities of India. So we have a negligible institutional care provision, whether for child care or elder care. So how we bring these two discussions together. And I was also curious to listen how the campaign envisaged the change in division of housework at societal and household level. Okay, agreed, women are paid or the care workers are paid. Will it change the gender roles? How? That is my curiosity to listen more on this.
Shraddha, is your question to any specific panelist or anyone can answer?
No, anyone, like whosoever is can address.
Thanks, Shraddha. Any other question? Can't see any hands. Hi, Parvati.
Hi.
Yeah.
I just wanted to, first of all, huge thanks for this just amazing session. It was incredible.
You are frozen. Oh dear. Anybody else while we get Parvati back? Hello. Okay. I think we can perhaps address Shraddha's question or right. Nina wants to speak. Nina.
Hello, thank you. Yes, I wanted to address the question that has just been put about the discussion. I'm sorry, I should have made clear that when we talk about housework, we do in fact mean caring work. It includes all aspects of caring work, so it's not a different concept, if you like. And in fact, we are now talking about a care income, which is in a way an update of wages for housework. In relation to gender roles, so it would include, childcare, elder care, whatever kind of care. But it's we are fundamentally talking about a relationship, because you cannot divide the person who's doing this work from the person that this work is being done for, who are also themselves doing care work. It's a mutual relationship. That's true with children, it's true with older people, etc. And in relation to gender roles, you asked, would you change gender roles? And I wanted to comment on what was said before, which was a kind of a critique of wages for housework, that we had never addressed the issue of gender roles, which is not exactly true. We feel it's very important, first of all, to get the recognition of the huge amount of work that women are doing. We feel that the fact that we are contributing this work should be a power for us, and instead it has been used to impoverish us. And if we want to deal with women's poverty, starting with the global south, we have to start with what women are contributing and therefore are entitled to reward for. But we also know very well that one of the reasons men are not doing this work, frankly, there's of course a physical division of labor to start off with, but after that, men are much more used to doing work for money than women are. And if this work was paid, I can assure you that men would have a different view of caring work than they do now. I just want to start with, I also wanted to mention, nobody mentioned the farmers' strike. We have been involved in supporting it, and especially putting forward all the work that women are doing for the strike, but also in the farms that is not recognized, as some of your speakers have said. And in fact, when we fought at the UN for unwaged work to be recognized, it included all the work on the land. So it's not true. It was in the home, on the land, in the community. So it's not true that we were only interested in housework in the metropolis, it's very much the opposite. We were interested in all the unwaged work internationally. And the majority of that work was done in the global south, if you have to put that together. So we were always a global south, global north campaign.
Global kitchen.
Right, the global kitchen we called it. That's right. That's I'm being reminded. That is exactly right. So let's just stop there. So.
Okay, great. Do we have Parvati back?
Yes, she's back.
Parvati, yeah. Hi, Parvati. Will you ask your question? Parvati? No, we don't seem to get her.
Yeah, she did come back in.
Okay. Anybody else has questions? Parvati. Parvati is offline. Okay. Do we have any other question? Well, that seems, we don't seem to be getting the technology very, so I would ask the panelists then to respond for a few 2-3 minutes each. Should we start with Devaki at this point? Devaki? Hi, Devaki. You need to unmute, Devaki. Devaki, unmute. Yes.
Oh, you want me to? Okay.
I'm just
I beg
saying,
your pardon.
do you want to speak for 2-3 minutes? Say anything further? Respond to the other panelists? I don't think she can hear me. Rohini, do you want to speak?
Okay, I mean, yeah, just to add a little bit, the reason why I brought up the issue of gender division of labor is that I think it's as much as the need for money or more money amongst working class women is the need for time and the need for help. And for example, even if you're caring for small children or a disabled relative, which can be an extremely, I know from experience, an extremely exhausting round-the-clock task. What you need is not just to be paid for it. Yes, that would help. But you also need some time off. You need someone else to do the work sometimes and help you. I mean, also, for example, if you're an elderly person or elderly people living alone, perhaps you could do with some help with housework. And just getting paid for it is not the point, really. Having someone come in with a proper, as a care worker, you know, properly paid person come in and help you would be very welcome. So shortening actual the working hours, which I think is also very much needed in this time of unemployment, because it would create more employment if working hours were shortened. I think that's a very key demand, which should be linked up with the demand for recognition and payment for housework and the need for help, you know, from, if you get it from the state, then that's fantastic. I don't see us getting it from the state here, but hopefully at some point one will get some help for, you know, today, as you were, who was saying, I think maybe Lalita, or you were saying that a lot of middle class housewives get get domestic workers to come and do the work. But what about the working class housewives? You know, they do their own work, they do someone else's housework, and sometimes many other people's housework as well. They're exhausted and they don't have time for themselves at all. So I think that whole thing, yeah, as you said, it's a very complex thing to sort out. And time and help, I think, are part of it. Yeah.
Thank you. Lalita, would you like to say a few more words? Lalita? No, you're muted.
Yeah. I went on speaking without realizing. I'm sorry. No, I just wanted to say that this gender relations is a very important issue to grapple with in every type of activity we are looking at. And I was the one talking about middle class women and poorer women and the different types of engagement with housework, and 70s, 80s, how it was different, today, how it is different. So I was trying to say many of us were middle class, but we had to do everything ourselves. We could not really afford to employ people. And when you employ people today, there is a different awareness even among domestic workers. They are being organized, especially in Hyderabad and in the Telangana region. They're very well organized groups of domestic servants. So, I mean, that is that apart. My main point would be we should never lose track of the political aspects to the question of work. The minute women are doing the work, it is considered devalued and less paid and unequal and all that. The same kind of work which is taken up by men is already paid better. Even today, that's how it is. Not just rural agricultural sector, but in every sector where technology is involved, even in a minimalist way, men are paid better to do the same kind of work that women have done for lesser work. That is in the public domain. But talking about the household and caring for the elderly and the sick and the children, cooking, fetching all the things like, water, or even going to the market and getting things, this should not be considered only as women's work. That kind of a political focus on issues we have to keep raising again and again, because I think the comfort sets in by allotting whatever values are making demands like that. You continue to do your labor, and this kind of household drudgery is benumbing. Your brain does not grow with it. You have to minimize, of course, reduce. You need to have leisure, like Rohini was saying, all that, but also to bring in. I have a feeling that the norms, the patriarchal norms, have to be questioned constantly, and we have to bring up our children differently. Boys have to be trained differently. That socialization of children we talk about, we are not paying enough attention. We still produce monsters, even as feminist women. So I feel that we need to question all those things, not just in individual family locations and spaces, but even in political debates and public platforms. I wanted to say that.
Thank you very much, Lalita. As usual, very insightful comments from all our panelists. I would just wrap up by saying two things. I think to go back to an old term used many decades ago. Sorry?
You didn't give me a chance also. The other two.
did. I asked you several times. You didn't speak.
Can I just leave 2 minutes because Lalita...
Yeah, sure.
I think at this point in the world economic stage, the roles how we handle it today was very important. But one of the things that we really have to go to is the unequal way contract labor deals with male and female labor. I don't know how many of you examined this. We did for the Maharashtra Employment Guarantee site. I see it every morning in front of our house. that gangs are made, and usually the gang is 6 men and 4 women, and the women are paid 1/3 of what the men are paid. Now, why do I raise that question? I think wage fixing of women, first recognizing them as an economic agent, adding to GDP, and then fixing some kind of wage, agitating for that with the labor ministries, agitating for that with local government. It's such a crucial thing now because women, as all the other panelists have said, are all working. I mean, they're contributing to economic, whether through homework or outside work. But that the monetization of that and the recognition of that in budget making, policy making, that leap has to be made if the sorrow and the sympathy that we are showing today has to be brought into some kind of a fruition. So at some point, I think this debate has to go into how to get the state to bring a more, enable women in the informal sector to unionize, B, for wage structures to be fixed by us in the women's movement, and labor laws to be inclusive of all these other things. And particularly if you look at now, contract labor is a very big thing. India is constructing like crazy all over India. And if you look at contract labor, it's an unequal wage structure. Here is an opportunity for us to fight for something which is very, very tangible, that labor is contracted with 2/3 men and 1/3 women, and the 1/3 women are paid half what the men are paid. These ways we may actually deal with what is a critical issue in my opinion in India, that is women workers in the masses. Of course, domestic work and all that, and I'm glad that everybody mentioned that domestic workers are now being unionized. And Nalini Naik is actually one of the observers here. She's very active in domestic workers union, and I think soon there will be more and more unions in every city. So that is at least been got some attention. But construction workers have not been given the attention I think we should do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Devaki, for that.
I'm sorry, can I make just one tiny short point?
Okay, sure.
Okay, I just want to say that for some reason, the recognition, better pay for low-paid workers, which has been raised, of course, a number of times, is being put as in contradiction with recognizing non-wage work. And these are really two sides of the same coin. Women, a lot of the work that women do also outside, a lot of that, there's factory work, there's farm work, there's also a lot of caring work, which is very low paid, and domestic work, which is very low paid. And it's non-wage work, it's caring work within the context of the family, but also all the unwage work on the farm, etc., was recognized and paid for. It would raise the status of this work, whoever does it. And it would also put us in a much better position to demand better wages when we do other work, because we would not be so desperate. And I think, we can't put it as a clash, quite the opposite. The domestic workers who are part of our network are campaigning for ILO protection for their work as domestic workers, as well as a care income, because they also are mothers. And if they were paid for the work they do as mothers, they wouldn't have to be domestic workers, which would definitely be an improvement for them. So, paying for caring work would actually raise everybody's status, all workers. And I think a lot of men are beginning to see that now.
Thank you, Nina, for that intervention. And I think we should recognize that there is no contradiction between fighting for fair wages and fighting for wages for housework. I mean, this is a question of demand for wages for unpaid work is not necessarily in contradiction with demand for better wages or better working conditions for waged work. I think we would all in the panel take that point. However, I would go back to the period of Marxist feminism that we have all invoked in our various presentations to pull out of history a term that became not very popular, but was floated at that time, housewifeization. And housewifeization was a term that is very similar to what we would today call informalization. So it was using that term was an insight into understanding the similarities between a housewife's work and the work and the very large variety of work in the informal sector of that time. However, since that time, the informal sector has also become bigger and bigger and more differentiated. So today, informal sector ranges from very well-paid jobs in the IT sector, freelance work of all kinds that are very well-paid, to the lowest end of the market. So informal sector today is a very, very wide and a vast sector. And today, and also as part of the process of globalization, we are various sort of scholars are saying we are now in the fourth industrial revolution, embarking on the fourth industrial revolution. So, and in this transformation that people are expecting in the productive organization, there is also the element of globalization. And one aspect of this new globalization is, in fact, not that we are becoming more formalized, but that the whole world is becoming more informalized. So we are, in fact, looking at a transformation towards fragmentation of work. And I think one of the tasks before a Wages for Housework campaign today will be to try and understand the changes in the nature of housework in today's very fast changing scenario of work. Is the meaning of housework the same in the today as it was in the 1980s or in the late 1970s when Wages for Housework in fact was floated as a campaign? And I think that would be for us to take forward the most pertinent question. I think various aspects of that question has been discussed by our panelists. There is a lot of continuity in some of these concerns, but there is also change. And the term care, in fact, the question Shraddha asked, the term care, in fact, does embody some of that change. And we need, I think, also to reflect on why the term care work has become so important. Why we talk much more about care work today than we talk about housework, or in fact reproductive work. What are the changes these terminology changes signal? And I would stop with that and hand the session back to Prabha.
Wonderful. Thank you, Samita, for that very, very eloquent conclusion, and to all our speakers for really, really wonderful interventions. I think it's just such a privilege to have these various perspectives to actually piece together, what exactly were the debates, what were the points of convergence and divergence, and what can we mine from it in light of our changed circumstances. So that was just absolutely excellent. Bring her back.
So there is a clear-cut continuum which is happening where women who where the entire notion of unpaid work